Good afternoon, everybody. When I was in Neugrave, there was not so far to go to what's behind me. Is the Gedenkstätte Bergen-Belsen, just an hour drive from Neugrave. So I decided to go today to pick up some books, and as with all my trips, I definitely have to buy another bag because it will be cheaper than pay overweight. There's a lot of books here to be bought. And of course, Bergen-Belsen is one of the camps that's very much known, especially because when the British Army liberated the camp, they did a lot of filming inside, and there's a 30 minutes version of the one you can see on YouTube of the liberation, and it's I haven't seen the whole film because I wasn't that staying here so long today. It closes at 5 o'clock. So this is as I said on YouTube, you can see it where they are torching the barracks with flamethrowers. They are bulldozing all the bodies into mass graves, and there are people dying and dead lying all over the place, which is terrible. And I felt sick to my stomach walking inside Bergen-Belsen, and it's not many camps that I always get the clenching of my jaw whenever I go to a memorial for the Holocaust or for the concentration camps. But the Bergen-Belsen really gave me a very bad feeling to my stomach, and of course because I have seen all the materials and the movie and everything, and from a standpoint where you can understand that the British Army was afraid for diseases to spread. But for bodies to be bulldozed into a mass grave, it's not pretty. It's the same when they forced the Nazis to exhume and remove the bodies of dead prisoners. You see, they are dropping them on the ground. They are throwing them into vans. It's a disgrace to see human beings being treated that way, though they are bodies. So Bergen-Belsen is definitely a terrible place, and then of course this is the history of Bergen-Belsen is started out as a Kriegsfangenlager in 1939. The Fallingbostel POW camp, Kriegsfangenlager, was established just a little bit up the road here, and this was an army training ground which was then converted into a POW camp. And then of course after the attack on the Soviet Union, where they captured 3 million soldiers, they had a need for a lot of POW camps. And then from June 1940 there was a worker camp here at Bergen-Belsen, was converted into a POW camp. By the spring of 1942, more than 40,000 prisoners had died inside here. Most of them, of course, Soviet prisoners of war who was basically just starved to death or worked to death or both. So the fate of them are terrible. And of course, when Italy gave up on the war, they started to arrest Italians. So this became an internment camp for Italian military inside the camp. And of course from October 1944 you see soldiers from the Polish resistance getting here, and then of course it continues until the liberation of the camp, of course. And as a concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen is only made into a concentration camp in April 1943, when the SS takes over part of the ground and establish a concentration camp for Jewish hostages. And these hostages were to be traded for Germans interned abroad, because a lot of Germans, of course, were sitting in prisons and were held captive in other countries. So these were hostages that were supposed to be traded into for Germans. And of course, as with Dachau, Bergen-Belsen in mid 1944 or August 1944, is a camp where prisoners are sent who are not longer able to work. And you can imagine the emancipated prisoners coming here, and the sickness is flourishing in the camp already. It doesn't take long before they are dead or are brought to their death, of course. By the way, the Soviet prisoners of war were put in the mass grave. I think they were burnt, cremated, and put in the mass grave, which is 1 kilometer from the camp, actual camp. And then from August 1944, they started to transport female prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau towards the camp to work as slave labor. So the most healthy, as with the Neugrave, the healthy prisoners are transported from Auschwitz-Birkenau and to work here. And then, of course, when the camp is liberated, this is a huge complex. 55,000 prisoners are left in the camp because the SS ran off. Many of the prisoners are dying after the war because of illnesses and the sickness that was raving through the camp. And of course, one of the most famous prisoners to be inside Bergen-Belsen is Anne Frank. She was among 1,000 Jewish women which were selected for work in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and she was sent here to Bergen-Belsen in October 1944. And then, of course, the conditions are terrible. Anne Frank is a young prisoner, of course, so her survival chances of survival is better than others. But in March 1945, she dies 15 years old, and her sister, Margot, who was 19, dies just before. So both of them succumb to illness inside the camp. And of course, this is why the camp is famous. A total of 55,000 prisoners die in the concentration camps, which brings the number of deaths for this area well close to 100,000 in the period. And then, of course, it was not an extermination camp per se, though they didn't feed the Soviet prisoners of war, so they starved to death and because of illness. But again, it was a camp where they were forced to hard labor, and then, of course, succumbed either to the work or were beaten to death. The conditions, as I said, at the end of the war were horrendous because there were so many sick prisoners. So Anne Frank, unfortunately, never got to see the end of the war because she died inside the camp. And as with many others, I was walking inside. You have the mounds where the bulldozers bulldozed the corpses into the ground, and then you have here Ruhe, here rests 1,000 souls, or 2,500. So there are mounds inside the whole area of the camp, and I will show you. What you see there is the exhibition, a very nice exhibition actually, or nice, yes, you understand what I mean. And then you have the entrance to the camp itself, and the camp itself is huge. If you want to go into the camp, you probably need 2 days to fully cover the exhibition, the camp, and everything inside. If you want to walk everywhere, and then of course there are no barracks inside. There is the terrible monument from the 60s, the communist era monuments they made, which is just a huge colossal thing inside. But that's the way it is. And you have some gravestones, which of course obviously the graves is not existing, and Frank and Margot has their own stone inside, so this is more of a commemoration than actually being a physical grave, because the bodies of course were either thrown into mass graves, burnt, and the ashes spread, or those who died at the end and after the war, of course. So many of the thousands of prisoners died after the war, and they weren't thrown into the mass graves as far as I know. But when the British Army came and liberated the camp, the bodies that were lying inside the camp were bulldozed into the mass graves. And of course, again, if you watch this movie, it's I mean, you can only imagine the smell and the sounds and everything, and you see half rotten bodies, you see dead bodies, you see prisoners who are not able to move, lying on top of other corpses eating, so the conditions at the end here was terrible. It reminds very much of Treblinka too, but this was during in 1942-43. The commandant of Treblinka, he lost control of the camps, so there were bodies lying everywhere. They'd killed them so fast, so they weren't able to dispose of the bodies, and they buried them in mass graves. They had excavators, the largest excavators you can see today in mines, which you can put 4 cars inside. That kind of excavators that had in Treblinka to bury the bodies, and still they weren't able to get rid of them fast enough. So the camp was in total disarray. They lost total control, as the same happened with the camp here, I think. And of course, at the end of the war, many of the SS guards, officers, and everybody were running for their lives or trying to hide so they wouldn't be caught inside the camps. And then, of course, the prisoners more or less left to themselves, to tend for themselves. But as you see in Neuengamme, in other camps, they actually start killing actions against the prisoners that are inside the camp. The 20 children from Auschwitz, which were in Neuengamme, who were subjected to medical experiments, were killed the very last day of the existence of the camp. And you see this happening other places as well, where they actually start murdering down the prisoners. But here, I think they just left everything in disarray. So. You can see it on YouTube, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and it's a terrible movie to watch. But this was the conditions, and prisoners inside this camp, they were deteriorated really fast, and it came at a late stage of the war, of course, being a concentration camp in 1943, so it existed as a concentration camp only for a couple of years, and then of course was liberated by the British Army. I'm going to go back here because of course this is my first visit. I just wanted to go inside and have a look, and then now I'm going back to Hamburg, a couple of hours drive from here. But this is definitely a place to visit if you are in the area, and there is a cafe inside. There's a movie theater where you can see the movies, and there is a lot of objects found in the ground. Comms, personal objects, which you can see here. So there is definitely stories to the things you can see inside, and but it's not a nice place. I get a very bad feeling when I walked into this camp, and it's still there because it's was one of the worst places. I mean, all the places were terrible, but. The thing is, the camps that had industries connected to the war effort, or sorry, I'm just opening the car now, had the industries connected to the war effort, and like weapons production and